Thank you for joining us today.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we have a great crowd. I guess a bunch of transit nerds are all here.
My people.
Right? That's why we're all here to hear the Secretary speak. So I want to start off with having you help us understand what DOT does, because it's a big agency, and I think a lot of people are not aware of kind of the day-to-day work, but also just what its portfolio really includes. So if you can give us a broad overview of what the agency is trying to do.
So rather than talk through kind of trains, planes, automobiles, space, pipelines, I think the way I try to make sense of our scope is across the three sets of things that we do, which I think of as build, run, protect. So build is the part that's in the news the most. The Biden-Harris infrastructure package, obviously we're building $500 billion worth of things, funding projects, 60,000 projects and counting. It's everything from something like the Hudson River Tunnel, that's one of the biggest public works projects of our time, to a six-figure grant to redo a streetscape to make it safer in a rural town. So that's build. Two is run. And the interesting thing, and probably the biggest misconception about our department, is we don't run much. We don't run the highways, right? The states do. We just regulate them and fund them. We don't run the railroads. We regulate them. The big exception to this, though, is the FAA, which is bigger than the rest of our department combined. It actually predates our department. And that, of course, very directly owns and operates our air traffic organization and other parts of our aviation system in what I believe is perhaps the most complex civilian 24/7 operation we have in the government. So build, run a little bit, more than a little bit, and then protect. And that's really the regulatory side of things that seems unsexy but is wildly important. Protecting anybody who comes into contact with any of our transportation systems, from a new FTA regulation to protect transit operators like bus drivers from being assaulted, to Title VI civil rights protections to protect a homeowner who lives in the path of a proposed highway expansion, to the railway safety regulations that we put in place to make sure you got to have at least two people as a general rule on a train, which, believe it or not, was not a rule until recently. Or the work we're doing to protect airline passengers from unfair and deceptive practices. Most recently this week, pleased to announce that as an upfront protection that was a condition for us approving the merger of two airlines, requiring not just protections against junk fees, but also for the first time requirements around how a rewards frequent flyer program is run to protect passengers. So anyway, that's how I think about it. Building America's transportation systems for the future, running certain parts of our transportation system, notably aviation, air traffic control, and then protecting with everything from safety requirements to consumer protection.
Well, let's start with the building, because I think that is the, even though you told us to focus on the regulatory, I'm going to focus on the sexier part of it, which is the building. And so the infrastructure law is different than the ARRA, which was passed from the Obama administration, in that those were really trying to get shovel-ready projects done and in order to stimulate the economy immediately. Why are we not focused on shovel-ready projects anymore?
Yeah, so one way to think of it is that building all the infrastructure in 2009 was actually a means to an end. Those projects were deserving projects, they were worth doing, but the real reason that funding went through Congress, it was building the projects in order to put money in the economy, not the other way around. And so it was vitally important for any of that to work as stimulus, which is what we called it then, the stimulus, that those projects be more or less ready to go. This time around, we're dealing with something different. Of course, it is a stimulative fiscal policy to put $1 trillion into American infrastructure, and it's one of the reasons why we've had record-breaking job growth and 800,000 manufacturing jobs and construction jobs off the charts. But the focus is less on shovel-ready projects than on shovel-worthy projects. So, of course, we're excited to have the ones that are ready to go. I mean, nothing better than to be at a ribbon cutting for something that got done. And some of them have. But out of the 60,000 plus projects we're funding, many of them are just about to enter the construction phase, or we just broke ground. And again, there's a range of types of projects. Some shovel-worthy projects, the reason they haven't been done is they're so big and complicated that there wasn't the funding or the will to do them. So almost by definition, they're going to take a while. Others, though, really can be done as quickly as one construction season. And importantly, and this is another big difference this time around, we're funding the planning. A lot of our grants are just to get a project on the drawing board so that it can eventually move to construction. Because a lot of communities, especially some of the communities that have been left out in the past, low-income communities, tribal communities, more remote communities, some of the ones that have the most need, are also less likely to have the capacity to have millions of dollars to hire consultants and engineers just to draw something up so they could send it to our department for a yes or a no on funding with a 10% chance of success, right? So we don't want them to be that on the hook for the planning, which is why we're funding that too. So it is a different environment. Yes, it's growing the economy, but the real point here is not to have an infrastructure week or an infrastructure year, is to make sure the 2020s are an infrastructure decade such that by the time we're in the 2050s, economic security, job security, safety, climate, all of those outcomes are going better and more equitably because of the work we were doing and the intention we brought to it.
So I was in Italy recently, and this is a country that is less wealthy than the United States. It has fewer, a highly educated workforce, and yet I could take a train anywhere. And every once in a while, a map will circulate Twitter, which is like, oh my gosh, like this high-speed rail dream utopia. And everyone kind of goes, we know that's not going to happen. Or even just regular trains, like why can't we have access to that between major American cities easily? And one of the big reasons for this, of course, is that the cost of building transit in the United States is much higher than it is in other countries. And I'm wondering why you think that is.
This is the question, right? It's the why can't we have nice things question sometimes. And, well, I would say it's not just the cost. Part of it is just we just plain didn't invest. And some of that was a false economy, kind of like a leaky roof, where we let a problem get worse so that it is more expensive now than it would have been to fix it when we should have fixed it. But I don't disagree that we have a real issue with why it costs more pound for pound, mile per mile to build something here than it does elsewhere. And as you pointed out, like we can say if you're comparing what we're doing to what China's doing, you could say, okay, but we have labor standards. We don't just roll over communities. We have environmental standards. But that's less of an explainer when you're asking why the Dutch or the Italians or the Spain or Denmark can build something faster than us. So what's going on? The answer, of course, is it's complicated. You've covered this. But there are a few things that stand out. One is that we're a little out of practice at it. And it turns out for successful project management of very big things, somewhat intuitive here, one of the best things you can have done is done one recently. Like, what was the last $1 billion project you did? So the more we do, I think the better we'll get. That's one. The next one, and the one that probably gets the most political attention, is permitting, right? All of the procedure and process that goes into getting anything approved and then built. There's been a lot of introspection, I think, especially on the left, over whether we've got it right with our good intentions, with all of the requirements that we've put up. This is mostly coming out of the housing sector, where it's pretty clear that it's become too difficult to build housing in the US. But it also applies to infrastructure as well. But when we really dig into that, we have to ask, does it follow from that we should have fewer steps like public participation? I think the answer is no. We shouldn't have less inclusion of the public. It is true, though, that there are ways to make that process go more smoothly and more quickly. It includes, when does the public participation happen? If it's at the 11th hour versus early in the conception of a plan, it's going to be more disruptive. So have people at the table early. Another thing is, how does that actually get integrated into a plan? And remember, these things aren't there just to take up space. The reason there's things like a requirement that our department enforces that you include the public in a plan that has a major environmental impact is because community after community got divided, or in some cases whole neighborhoods just removed or destroyed by a previous way of building things in this country that was definitely speedy, but just gutted neighborhood after neighborhood. And of course, these were generally the neighborhoods that did not have the political power or the economic power to resist or reshape the kind of projects that were coming through their neighborhoods. So those protections are there for a reason. What we've got to do, I think, is figure out how to make them compatible with building good things well and swiftly. Then there's the fact that we have a jurisdictional mishmash in this country. I said build is the first of the three things we do. We don't actually literally build any of those 60,000 projects. Not one of them is one where we hire the contractor and do, right? There's a city or a state or an airport authority or a transit agency that's doing the actual building. And sometimes there's multiple ones. The hardest projects we're doing are where we have many states or many jurisdictions all trying to get the same thing done. Creating the kind of policy and political alignment to make that happen takes a lot of work. Then you have capacity. So, when you look at some of the most overburdened and underserved communities in the country, and there are lots of examples, low-income communities, rural communities, black communities, territories, but one that's especially glaring is tribal lands where tribal governments are expected to maintain huge numbers of lane miles of road with a tiny fraction, right, of the dollars that are available to most cities and states. And so they're not, when we're working to get them more federal grants, but when we do, if they've never had that kind of federal grant before, we can't just send them all the paperwork and say, call us when you're done. There has to be some side-by-side technical assistance. We're doing that too. We've got a program called Thriving Communities, far from the most famous of the dozens of programs that were created through the infrastructure package. But what it does is it allows us to connect with communities and link them up to capacity building partners, usually a nonprofit or philanthropy, to help them do things like the engineering or the compliance so that our own red tape doesn't get in the way of them getting help from us.
So I'm going to push you on this a little bit because this is my hobby horse. And one of the things that I find very difficult to watch is how this kind of sprawling network of local institutions, governments, many people who really do want to see good projects happen are unable to coordinate. And when we think about who is supposed to help them coordinate, it's supposed to be the federal government. And so what role does the federal government have then in not just giving dollars and saying, all right, as you said to me earlier, just come back in for the ribbon cutting and we'll see you there. And actually saying, are we involved in procurement? Are we involved in actually making sure the local permitting, the local land use is set before you get a single dollar from the federal government? If taxpayers across the country are giving California money to expand highways or to build high-speed rail, we should be getting a bang for our buck.
Yeah. So yes, the challenge is that the go-to instrument for doing that is yet another requirement, right? And it's the piling on of requirements that I think is often thought to be getting in the way. So I don't disagree, but I think the tension or the challenge for us is, when is it about more resources? When is it about making the process simpler? And then when is it a case where you actually can't achieve something here without trading off against one of your values there? In other words, when is it the case that you wouldn't have to soften some kind of thing you care about, like community input or other concerns, in order for this to happen more quickly? But yes, we need to work with project sponsors, and part of the culture that I'm trying to change in our building is from, I think, what has sometimes been a kind of a fire and forget approach, where up and until the moment where by law your money's about to turn into a pumpkin, we're not checking up on you that much, to saying, actually, even if the problem on its face is that you haven't gotten the paperwork into us so that we can sign the check, that's still our problem. And this is one area where I actually think political pressure is healthy, because if the projects aren't getting done, chances are people aren't going to be saying, where's the Secretary of Transportation where's the Highway Commissioner of that state? They're going to say, like, what are we doing about it, right? And I know my boss will be, right? I get this question locally, but also I can tell you, like, literally the last time I saw the president, the first thing he said was, how can we get some of these projects done more quickly? So it's definitely on our mind as an administration. And
what did you tell him?
I told him we're working on it. Things we figured out we can do, like, and this is getting super weedsy, but this is, I think, a safe space to be
everyone's trapped here with me. It's okay.
There are circumstances where we can release funding on the way to a grant agreement. So normal the way it works is, let's just imagine a hypothetical grant for illustration. So your grant gets picked. We call you. Congratulations, Mayor. Your city is getting this grant. We do the announcement. Then there's a process waiting for what's called a grant agreement. Normally that takes a year or two. And that has to happen before we can cut the check. And actually, we don't literally cut the check until after you've spent the money with the reimbursement. Anyway, one of the things we're looking at is, okay, can we have the grant agreements take half as long as they used to? What would that take? Mm-hmm. And so that's one thing we're working on. And it turns out things just like really simple things like pre-populating a form can matter when we're doing industrial scale grant making. Like I said, 60,000 projects, right? Another thing, though, that can make a difference is saying, okay, we're going to authorize you to spend this funding. We're not going to cut the check for you, but if you're ready to float this much money to get the ball rolling before we've signed the agreement, that's okay. Mm-hmm. And there's various things that have to be met in order for that to happen. We think it's called pre-award authority, and another thing is partial obligation. We think those tools might help us get the dollars flowing and the dirt moving quicker, even while other parts of a big project are still taking shape. So we put all of this in a memo, hoping by the next time I see the president, there's some comfort in the work that we're doing. But it turns out it's really hard. I mean, it's really hard to do these big things. And yes, the biggest problem was there wasn't any funding. Mm-hmm. But when you solve that problem, all the other problems, and we haven't even gotten to supply chains or workforce availability, mm-hmm. As well as procedural stuff, red tape, all of those problems surface. But here's one of many reasons why it's so important, one way to think about it, then one thing I've challenged my team to think about. If we're talking about $1 trillion of infrastructure spending, that means if you make it 1% more efficient, that's another $10 billion worth of things that get done. Or to put it the other way, for every 1% less efficient you are than you could have been, $10 billion of value is destroyed. And that's more than the transportation budget of many entire states. Mm-hmm. There's one other thing I want to mention that public policymakers have to think about, which is which risk are you worried about more? The risk of a project going wrong or the risk of a project not happening at all? There will be more headlines when a project goes wrong. And I can tell you, even though we're working to make sure every single one of them is perfect, out of the 60,000 projects we're funding, not every one of them is going to be perfect, mm-hmm. right? So you think about, to take an example from a different side of the government, things like Solyndra, right, that made all kinds of headlines, were huge political football 10 or 15 years ago. That was out of a Department of Energy grant program that was specifically designed to deal with risky investments to try to catalyze a market. That will make way more news if we fund something and we didn't cross all the T's and dot all the I's and hold the project sponsor to go through every single hoop just to make sure everything's perfect, right? And something blows up. That's going to create more headlines than something taking a year longer than it should. Even though if it takes a year longer than it should in today's economy, just with what's going on in construction, that might mean it costs 20% more than it would have.
So you brought up this idea of trade-offs, right? When you're trying to build faster, and then there are all of these check boxes in the way. Often those check boxes, as you mentioned, are there for good reason. They're there to make sure you're not trampling over a marginalized community. They're there to make sure you're not cutting corners on environmental regulation. Some of those check boxes, though, aren't actually trade-offs, as you mentioned. Some of them are just pre-populating a form. Mm-hmm. But even some of these bigger ones, when we think about the permitting legislation that is coming in front of Congress right now, right? The argument it's making is that actually the trade-off is that people can't sue regardless of the environmental impact. That a lot of our environmental laws, they're called that, but they're being utilized by individuals and by groups for blocking projects, regardless of whether or not there's a serious and genuine concern for conservation or the environment. So what do you want to see happening on permitting to make things faster? Do you support that bill? Or what sorts of trade-offs do you think we need to be making to move faster in that space?
Well, there's already some legislation that's gone through that I think is helpfully creating different mileposts here. So it sets, for example, a shot clock or a goal of 1 year on the kind of mid-level and 2 years on the most complex permitting. And since doing that, we've been able to cut that process in about half on the projects we're tracking. Some of it's public transparency, just putting online tools, which we now have on what's called a permitting dashboard, so that if people are saying, how come this project isn't going anywhere, they know they can kind of see it and call somebody. I think it's really important. I'm not averse to the idea of improving the process, because I think what you're describing is true. The word environmental does a lot of work in the environmental legislation or the environmental process, not all of which is actually about the environment. More than that, it can slow down or stop projects that are manifestly good for the environment, like things we need for domestic clean energy, EV sourcing, or refining and things like that. So let me mention one other thing that we need to think about and that we're going to need to contend with. So right now, one form of public comment is in the Administrative Procedures Act. When we put out a rule, we do a notice, and then everybody gets to weigh in. And then by law, we have to read every comment everybody sent in. We don't have to agree with them, but we have to at least read them. And that process can add a lot of time to a rulemaking, and it's there for a good reason. Everybody, especially something where industry and labor have something to say, they get their chance to weigh in. Right now, some of our regulations on airlines, for example, we don't just do it by fiat. We put out the rule, and the proposed rule, and the airlines can weigh in, and passengers can weigh in, and consumer groups can weigh in. Okay. So probably the least sizzling use of artificial intelligence that keeps me up at night. It's not the nanobots and the gray goo coming to eat us all, but it's the bureaucratic equivalent of that. Mm-hmm. What if you can automate comments with AI so that at the click of a button, instead of just form letters, millions of comments could be generated on every little regulation we're trying to do. And even though you can use a robot to write them, we're not allowed to use a robot to read them, which means a human, federal employee, has to go through them all. That could gum up the entire administrative process. Obviously, that was not contemplated when the Administrative Procedures Act and related legislation went in. So I guess what I'm saying is, if that's a problem today, I think it's about to be more of a problem. And it's one of many things, super unsexy, wildly important, that we got to get a handle on when we're coping with AI.
So you brought up workforce issues as a part of trying to get a lot of these projects built. A big part of the construction workforce in this country has historically been immigrants, folks who are migrating across the Mexican border and coming into the country in order to help build, whether it's housing, but also transit projects and a variety of things that we consider important, capital projects that we needed. What do we need to see then on immigration? Do we need to expand the types of visas that are available to bring people in to help do that? Or otherwise, given our unemployment rate is pretty good, are we going to be drawing from other industries to pull people into construction?
Well, I think most people align with a sort of commonsensical view that you want to have it be harder to unlawfully immigrate and make it simpler to lawfully immigrate. And every time since 1996 that America has tried to do something about that, it's gotten destroyed by politics. Most recently, of course, the border bill, which was not a comprehensive fix, but it was something that would have made a difference. And of course was destroyed for political reasons. But when it comes specifically to construction, first of all, let's acknowledge the role that immigration plays in the construction workforce. One haunting example of that is that all of the 6 people who lost their lives on the Francis Scott Key Bridge out there in the middle of the night, on a cold night, fixing potholes and making it possible for everybody to commute on that bridge, were all immigrants from Central America. But it goes to, I think, a broader question about the workforce, whether we're talking about immigration or whether we're talking about workforce training more generally, which is we're actually still leaving a lot of talent on the sidelines because of obstacles that shouldn't be there. And a very simple example is I've talked to workers who are working mothers who are talented and qualified in construction. But if, not just mothers, but it tends to come up more when you're talking to working moms. A lot of places to beat the heat, I mean, think about DC, right? In the summer construction season, you get ahead of the heat by having a very early shift, like 4 or 5 in the morning is when it starts. And what are you supposed to do with your kids? So it turns out that you can use federal formula highway dollars for workforce. And if your state is willing, this is one thing Josh Shapiro, for example, has done very effectively through an executive order in Pennsylvania. I went with the First Lady to Pittsburgh. They're doing $1 billion airport terminal. There's a childcare at the construction site, which means there's a lot of people who can get those good paying jobs who just wasn't on the table for them. But not only is that the right, that's pretty exciting, right? Not only is that the right thing to do for the workers, and especially as we're trying to get more people who have historically been underrepresented in unionized building and construction trades, and that includes workers of color and it includes women. It's also just really important getting the project done because workforce and human capital is one of the constraints on all of this. The other thing I really love about this, though, is when we get it right, and I saw this in Vancouver, Washington. I was with the representative there, Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, and she insisted that I go to this program training high school age students for futures in the trades. And there was something about just how they were just like standing up taller. Like they were just, you could tell that they weren't just once they had this exposure through this program and they learned how to kind of build a mock-up of a house and do these things that would prepare them for apprenticeships. They weren't just looking at the industry differently. They were looking at themselves differently because they realized how much they could be earning. And the more we can do to cultivate that, the more we're going to have it reach more people this time around in a way that I think was a miss for American construction in past generations.
So one of the ideas that has been floated, and this gets to another one of my hobby horses, which is housing. And housing in transportation's country has not been linked at the federal level. I mean, you guys at DOT don't do a lot on housing specifically, but when you think about federal dollars going to local communities, surface transportation block grant, for instance, this has historically been used as a tool to encourage better policy at the state level. For instance, in raising the drinking age, we conditioned that national highway funding on doing that. What do you think about conditioning surface transportation block grants or other federal transit dollars on making local political actors better on housing policy, whether it's upzoning near transit stops? If you're going to give you a bunch of money to build a station, like we need to be able to build some housing near that station. So how do you think about that as a tool?
Well, first of all, when we're promoting that, we want to, I think that's really interesting to explore. I want to make it clear, though, that we don't only have to have a cudgel to do that with. It can't just be like, do this or you won't get your money. I think because we already have so many strings attached to our money, and they're all there for a good reason. But the point of these federal dollars is to help project sponsor get stuff done. It has to be the right stuff, or at least it has to be legal. But but we know that like some project sponsors or states are probably ahead of us in their sophistication or their ambition on things like climate or how to think about housing rights. So we want to make sure, yes, we want to lift the floor. We don't want to wind up being the lowest common denominator, which is the converse risk when you have too many strings attached. All of which is to say, in addition to conditions and things that are attached to federal dollars, we're also just trying to make sure that we're funding and not just urging these kinds of things. So just this week, we released funding, far from our biggest program, but about $50 million to help with planning on things like how housing could relate to the development of infrastructure. We have a lot of loan funding available for transit-oriented development. And you'd mentioned international comparisons earlier. Being smart about this can unlock huge amounts of value, solve many problems at once, and sometimes help capitalize a project too. If you look at how the central train station in Berlin got done, part of it was that they understood the value of the air rights directly on top of it, and then leveraged what they were able to fund by having an office building built up there to help fund some of the other things that had to happen in the guts of the station. So especially at a time when we see this shift toward maybe a lot of square footage that was built for commercial purposes, probably better used for residential. But it's tricky to get that right because, of course, it was built that way for a reason, and the floor plates don't quite match, and sometimes the site doesn't match. But if you're adding a whole new transit station, maybe that changes the answer rate. These are exactly the things we want to help communities figure out. And through a kind of unsung part of our department called the Build America Bureau, we're using loan financing as well as grants to help connect the dots for communities that are innovating that way.
Well, I could do this for another hour, but they will kick me out. But let's all thank Secretary Buttigieg for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. This is great.